name is Brenda. I'm a senior at South Milwaukee High School.
Hi, my name's Ivy. I'm a junior at South Milwaukee High School.
I'm really passionate about arts because of the free creativity and freedom we get whenever we're doing, and then you're listening to SMY podcast.
Welcome to the SMY podcast. My name is Daniel Bader. Report cards are as part of school as pencils and chalkboards. The goal of the report card is to give parents an idea of where their students are in their studies and serve as an early warning sign that they might be struggling in a subject and need some help. Schools and school districts have report cards too, for many of the same reasons. Today, we're going to hear from some people who report the data back to the state and who also use that data to improve how our schools operate. Then we'll hear from Superintendent Deidre Roemer about some system-wide changes she's putting in to help South Milwaukee schools improve for students, and on the report card. Here with me to talk about our report cards today, which are coming out next week, is Christy Gajewski, Director of Curriculum and Instruction, and Carrie Stolenwerk, our new Director of Pupil Services and a former principal. Thank you guys for being here.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Thanks.
So tell me about what data parents can read in our school report cards.
So our school and district report cards have actually a lot of data that goes into figuring out those scores, both for the district and for the schools. So some of the data that goes into that is student achievement data, so how students are performing on the state exams that they take every year. From that, then they also calculate growth, so they look at scores from year to year, usually a 2 to 3 year window, to calculate the growth overall for those cohort groups of students. Then there's the target group outcomes, which is a newer indicator, which kind of lets schools and districts know who the groups of students are that they need to focus on, who are maybe experiencing some learning gaps.
What would be an example of a target group?
Students who speak multiple languages, for example,
okay.
Or students with special needs. Some of those identifications then help us understand where we need to focus some attention.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Then there's also the on-track and post-secondary readiness, which shows like graduation rates and things like absenteeism and chronic absenteeism. Those kind of fill in those scores. And then we get an overall score, which is based on all of those pieces of data, and it's weighted based on the student groups that we have in the district. So for example, because our school district has a population of students who could identify as low income, our growth score is weighted heavier for us because it's that whole value add. It takes a longer time, it takes much more effort to support students who have been experiencing those learning gaps. So our growth score is weighted higher than some of the other areas.
So when you say weighted higher, you mean that when there's progress in that or decline, that factors higher into the score at the end?
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay.
And it would be different for other school districts. It's a way to kind of try to level the playing field across the state for how schools are supporting students from different backgrounds.
Mm-hmm. And Carrie, what should they take away when they see some of the, is this telling parents about their kids, or is this telling them about the teachers and the structure behind everything?
Yeah, so it's speaking to how a school district and the schools within it are addressing those specific areas. So it'll tell you how we're performing on absenteeism as compared to other schools in the state. It'll tell you how we're performing on our student growth, are we seeing growth from year to year as compared to other schools in the state. So it's going to give parents a nice snapshot of where their school is currently performing and should help them to have some questions about how they're growing.
So when it says something like, X number of students not reaching these things, should I take away that my kid's cohort, that grade level, is struggling as a whole, or is it really that reflection of what a school is doing, how the school is?
It's a tough question. I think it's kind of a both and.
Yep.
I think, for us, when we look at, this is cohort data, so it's how all of the students performed overall. But parents can also Typically, parents can have an idea of how their student may have contributed to that based on getting the forward exam scores when those are sent out. Usually, toward the end of the school year is when parents get the copy of their own student's performance. Usually, that will give you an indicator of how your own child performed. But that's only one significant piece of the data, piece of the data. It really, I don't know how to explain that exactly, but it's kind of both and. Like your student scores, their coming to school, their participation, all of that matters, but it is really kind of a large scale bird's eye view of how the school and the district are performing and supporting kids overall.
Yeah, maybe I could back up for a second and actually just talk about what this is. This is a report from the state to the community to say how our schools are doing in educating students.
Right. It's speaking to very specific metrics, though. So, it doesn't capture the school culture and the student experience. That's something that we as a school district are working on better defining and building a plan for. So, this doesn't capture that.
Yeah.
It really does give you, hard data measurements.
Right. So, it's not like a poor schools. Well, I've been in schools that scored, not here, but have scored really low on their state report cards. But I would send my kid there in a second because I love the principal, I love the teachers I've met, those kind of things. So it's kind of a conundrum because what you're reading, as an overall score doesn't seem to reflect the reality when you're in there.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, it doesn't tell the whole story.
Nope.
So this is us, in the administration here, providing specific metrics, specific data to the state. What are, you kind of listed them, but what are, how do we even get those?
So our achievement and growth data comes from a couple of places. For elementary schools and middle schools, it's the forward exam. We take the scores. The kids take the forward exam starting in 3rd grade, and they take it all the way through, I think, 10th grade.
Yeah, and what's a forward exam study? What does it
Forward
ask?
exam is usually in most grade levels reading and literacy and math, and then in a couple of the other grade levels, they also put in, in 4th grade, 8th grade, and 10th grade, they layer in social studies and science learning as well. So it is typically content, and and it's aligned to the state standards. So it's kind of really measuring how well have the kids learned the standards. Have they reached mastery of those standards? And it's given at the end of the year. So it's everything that kids have learned, they're going to be kind of assessed on some of those pieces.
Even maybe a more silly question, but is it a paper Scantron fill-in test? Is it it a reading
question.
circle?
It's done on the computer.
Yeah.
It's done on the computer, and so kids, have to learn to navigate that. So, and it usually, the testing window is, usually over about a month's worth of time, and our teachers really try to break it up for kids so they're not testing all day long.
Yeah.
So they might do one reading test one day, and then the second reading test the next day, and the same thing with different math and science pieces. So they don't test them all day, every day, but they do try to be strategic and test that. Say, we're going to do a reading test. We try to, in the same environment the students are learning reading, we want to try to have them tested during that time. So it's not a complete disconnect from what the kids are already doing, because while the test is important, we also know that our kids are more than that test. But we do want them to take it seriously, because it really does show whether or not we address the standards well in our teaching and learning over the course of the year.
Sure.
But I think the other thing to keep in mind with the forward test and with any testing is that it is a measure of the way a child performs on a test that day.
Yeah.
So many students, aren't particularly good testers. It doesn't mean that they don't demonstrate the learning in other ways, but on this test on that day, it's a snapshot.
Yeah.
So it's important to remember that the test scores are only one way of measuring what a student is learning in school.
Right. Sure. And I guess you would expect that the average eventually would come out to give you a good idea of everybody, right?
Yeah, and then for high school, they also include the ACT. And then the other metrics, since like I said, there are other metrics too,
That's just
where
one
we
part.
look at chronic absenteeism, which is the number of students who are chronically absent, is if they're absent 10% of the school days that are allotted. So if they're absent 10% at 180 days, if they miss 10% of school, that's a lot. So they measure that. We get kind of points based on how close we are. We also, one of the things that does go into our report cards as well, is the number of students tested. So if the school district dips below 5% of students who don't take the test, we can receive a loss of points in that area. So I know that, that's kind of been, for some families, they don't want them to take these tests and things like that. And they always have the ability to opt out. But again, like Carrie said, it's a snapshot one day, how they're performing on that particular day. And we just really encourage the kids to at least try it, whether or not, but I get every family has their beliefs on that, so we understand, but just know that there is a small consequence written into the ESEA law that if we don't, have that many students, if we have more than 5% students either not show up and take the test or opt out, it does impact that overall score.
And say it sounds like two of those metrics can hurt you and doubly hurt you, right? Because 5% don't come to school and 5% don't take the test. You get dinged both times. And I imagine people remember, it wasn't that long ago, this idea of testing and high pressure. Imagine that. Do you hear that from parents? That's why they don't want to take the test?
I think so. And I think, the perception is still, high stakes testing. I mean, there's accountability attached to it, right? So anytime there's accountability attached, it does feel high stakes. But I think what has shifted and then that was in the era of No Child Left Behind.
Yeah.
When we were specifically trying to make sure 100% of the kids were, moving and grooving and proficiency, in a certain time frame. I think it was until 2011 or something, whenever that law changed. But then the law had been reauthorized, had been adjusted, and some of the accountability tools and measures have also changed. There's still accountability at the state level because we receive federal funding, and that's part of the reason why we have to have these report cards. But at the same time, we recognize now that these tests are a snapshot and they're an indication of where the system is and where we might potentially have gaps with students, that we need to restructure our, internal metrics or retool some of the teaching practices that we're doing to try to address and engage more students in learning and those kinds of things. But we don't use those tests in any way, shape, or form to say a teacher hasn't been performing or things like that. It's not tied to that, where in some states it has been.
I'd say that was the second iteration after Race to the Top, right? Then it was tied to teachers, which also is not exactly a great measure.
Right.
And I can see where some of that attendance comes from, because I know No Child Left Behind was purposely meant to stop warehousing special education students, right? Because if you could keep them from taking the tests, then maybe your scores would be better and you would get better funding. So there's some gamification, and then we're talking 2 decades of adjusting these kind of things.
Yes.
So we have attendance data. I know we'll talk to our superintendent a little bit about some of the changes, but you said aligning, it's kind of identifying for us some problems in the system that either we are not scoring well on because we're doing it wrong, or we're actually scoring, recording it incorrectly, or but something else. What are the other benefits of this to the school district, the report card? Long pause.
Yeah, long pause. I think...
I know school improvement plans seem to have come out of them, right?
Yeah, school improvement plans, and really having an awareness of how we're supporting all kids, because like you mentioned, in the Race to the Top and No Child Left Behind, groups of students were kind of deliberately pulled out of the general education population. And that's not exactly best practice. It's not good for kids. And this helps us at least say, okay, we're doing really great in this area, but we might need to adjust some of our teaching practices and things like that to support more kids, engage more kids. So that's where the strategic planning and the district strategic plan kind of come into play. It at least helps us pinpoint areas that, when you work in a school district, you're serving the greater community, and it can feel very overwhelming because you feel like you have to fix every single thing because you're seeing kids on a daily basis. But it's impossible to do that, and we have to be able to strategically pick the things that will help the system move forward overall. And if we know that we've got certain groups of students if there are trends in all of our schools where we might be inadvertently creating gaps among students, then that helps us look at, is it the resource that we're using? Is it a teaching practice that we've tried and isn't working? Is it, is it really attendance? How many days have kids missed school? So it really helps us really try to identify where the areas are that we actually have control over fixing, to pick those things that will help the system grow overall.
Sure.
I think too, as a principal, it was really helpful in facilitating conversations as a whole staff around like where did we identify opportunities based on this and how were we building a plan to address it, and to normalize conversation about what was working and what wasn't. Like this just really provides that very natural entry point to that conversation so that we do live in a place of we're always trying to get better.
Yeah, I guess even if it's not a perfect yardstick, you have someone else's yardstick to say this is what we have to measure up to.
Right, and there's no perfect yardstick, so it's not the only one we use, but it is one of them that provides us with some really nice normed data.
Yeah, I kind of opened a door with school improvement plans. Can one of you explain what that is and what they're used for?
Yeah, sure.
So a school looks at their baseline data, so how we're performing in the areas of like academics. We do usually include culture and climate and student engagement, attendance, parent and community relationships. So based on those, we identify where our opportunities for growth as a school are, and we write a plan. And the plan has components aligned to each of those areas. So we worked with our staff to identify what would be our goals, and then to build objectives, measurable objectives within each goal area. And that drove our work, and we came back to it regularly at staff meetings to talk about where are we. We used a red light, green light system to see like how we were progressing toward the goal in each of the areas.
Okay, and that's kind of what happens on professional development days. I imagine you have a check-in about that.
Yes.
In your guys' experience, do all schools have school improvement plans, even if they are scoring really well?
Yes.
Yes, I mean, that's kind of part of, is written into the federal law, is that it's kind of continuous improvement is written into the federal law, and it was written in deliberately into the state plan as well to make sure that, even if a school's scoring well, there's still students who might not be reached, right? So you still have to kind of have, or you might not be communicating well, or you might not have the best culture and climate in one school and have great climate and culture in another school. So it really does give us just kind of a starting point for improvement conversations. But yeah, most school districts should. I'm not going to say all, because I know that I cannot speak for the 411 school districts in the state. But it is written into the federal and state law that we're supposed to have continuous improvement.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what's not in the report card.
Sure.
Like they can measure data points that we can fill out on a form or submit electronically, but how do what are some of the things that are not shown on a report card?
I think a lot of the student engagement stuff is not really, we know that attendance and graduation rate and things like discipline and stuff are indicators there could be an issue, but it's not necessarily spelled out for us.
So they
kids
don't
aren't
count.
coming to school because they're anxious is not something that would populate on a report card from the state. So then it's up to us to dig a little bit deeper and kind of figure out, well, what's preventing kids from coming to school? Is it something that's without their control because their families are hit a struggle spot and don't have a vehicle to get them here? Or is it something more, what does the national trend say post-COVID? Kids aren't coming as regularly as they used to. So those are all things that are not on there and that we kind of try to dig in and find out more information about, well, how do we help kids get here? For attendance-wise anyway.
I think family engagement, too, is a really big one. I think particularly coming out of COVID, that as we try to strengthen relationships between families and schools and really be strategic partners, that there's a lot of opportunity there. And it's a harder thing to measure, but schools work really hard to figure out kind of where they are with that and how they can improve. So that's a big one. And staff engagement, too. So like using a totally separate survey to ask staff, like, how are you feeling about the work? How are you feeling about the job responsibilities? What do you need to keep doing the work or to improve? So, I mean, really making room for some of those things, which are drivers for how the things that the report card does measure come up.
Got it. So they don't ask how many kids are engaged in extracurricular activities, how many athletes do you have, nothing like that. So
No.
So if everybody left here at 2:30 or 3:30, depending, or when they get out here, 2:55, that if everybody went home and there was nothing that happening after school, no pep rallies, nothing, then that wouldn't score at all. On
You
the
would have
report
no
card.
way of knowing that from the report card.
Got it. What should a parent, your average parent, A, should they look at these, period, and B, what should they take? Do you think if they should they take away from when they read it?
Yeah, that's another tough question. We don't want to hide anything. We don't want to hide anything. They are public domain as of November 14th. And, we do know that families who consider moving into different areas in the school systems, they look at them.
Yeah, I was going to say open enrollment.
They do look at them. But, I think what makes people anxious is that sometimes it doesn't always look that great, and it only gives a surface level of what's actually happening in those schools. So I think you're going to see that we've had several of our schools improve over the last year, and one school that saw a decline. So when those scores come out. And it's one of those things where it is painful to be a part of a school system and be at the school where you saw a decline, because everyone in that building is working their tails off. And so keep that in mind, right? So if you're looking at your school and you see, oh, my school is the school that went down, what's happening over there? Well, actually, it's a lot. There's a lot of layers that we have to sift through to figure out what exactly happened to cause those scores and that configuration to see a decline instead of an increase like some of our schools. So just know that the people who work in those buildings are working their tails off to try to figure it out. They want to hear from you about, how you think your kid's doing and what, those kinds of questions and things like that. But I think we just have to be cautious and know that there are people behind this, and that, nobody wants their score. I mean, even when we were in school, right? Like, you took a test, you never wanted to get an F on your test, but you also knew, oops, I got to fix something, right? So it does not feel good. It is very stressful to receive those scores. But it is also kind of a rally cry to say, hey, we got to come together and figure this out. So just know that when schools get an identification or they receive a report card score that looks less than stellar, there are people that are working on it to try to help improvement. And I think our superintendent is going to talk a little bit about like our strategic planning for the school district and how that layers into it as well. But I think that's the biggest takeaway is, it is important to take a look at. We are judged. I mean, I would be lying if I said we weren't, but
I also think that, it's great to have some understanding of the report card, but if you have questions about your school, get involved. Like, join your PTO, PTA, have conversations with teachers, with the principal, like, get to know the climate and culture and the work of every day that's happening in the school, because that's way better information than this one snapshot.
yep.
Interesting. And I guess conversely, should we celebrate too much when a school does get better?
I think we have to celebrate, because they have really collectively come together and worked for the students and the staff have come together to show those improvements. So yeah, we need to celebrate, but we don't want to celebrate so much that the other schools feel defeated.
Yeah.
It's just like, okay, we did this, and then it's what we do on like the professional learning days and calibration, or in professional learning communities, is kind of talk about what happened, what went well, what didn't go well, and how are we going to try to come together and take ownership of this so we can move forward.
And maintain it. I mean, I think that's as a building principal, for me, that was the danger of celebrating too much, was that, yes, we want to celebrate, but we also have to be really aware of the fact that it's like a moving target, and we have to keep figuring out how we're going to continue to grow and get better. So
I was going to say, you lose a class every year and you gain a class every year, right? So there's turnover every year in schools. Well, guys, Christy Gajewski and Carrie Stonework, thank you so much for being here today.
Absolutely.
thank you.
Joining us now is Superintendent Deidre Roemer. Thank you and welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me on, Dan.
Again. So we just talked about everything that goes into a report card and everything not in a report card. It's kind of the district's job, your team's job, to try to improve those scores. Even if you get the best scores, you want to keep working on improvement. What are some of the things that we do to try to work on our report card scores?
There's a ton of things that we do as a district and as a system that really do boost up those scores as best that we can. One is to make sure that kids understand the material that goes into them, right? So all the work that we've been doing around early literacy, that's what it's designed for, is to make sure that kids can read. Reading is such an important skill. This is one way that we get a snapshot of how well our kids are doing in reading compared to other kids across the state and compared to other kids in our region, right? So that is an important measure because we want to know that our kids are making growth at a commensurate rate to other people in our area. And then a lot of the work that we've been doing at the high school around understanding what the data tells us. We've been doing a lot of work for the last couple of years around data literacy. So what does a score on the ACT tell us? And as much as I am not a huge fan of standardized tests, they are the measures by which we're publicly judged. And the nice part about taking those when you're as the state assessment is then we have students that get to take a practice opportunity at the ACT, or they get to use that ACT score to go on and apply to colleges. And it opens up some doors for our kids. A high score on the ACT can come with scholarship money or other things that we want to make sure all kids have access to. So paying attention to how kids do on those standardized tests, even if we don't love the standardized test, is important. And they break all those tests down. They'll tell us right in the forward exam. Third grade students are struggling with, levels of comprehension. High school students are struggling with identifying these elements of literature or these pieces of math. And then that tells us to go back and look at all of our curricular documents to make sure that we have the right components in there to address the areas where our kids are doing well and we can keep going strong in those areas, and address the areas where we're seeing some skills gaps. Hey, where do we need to add something to the curricular options to make sure that our kids have a really solid experience and can perform well at whatever they're going to do?
Sure.
This particular measure is based off of the ACT for high school kids, and for the elementary and intermediate and middle school students, the forward exam. But we want the kids to feel confident anytime they're asked to show me what you know, that they can do it.
Right. And like we said, it's helpful, I imagine, for you to have someone else's yardstick, right? So and to build kind of trust out in the public that at least this is a common yardstick that we're all being measured against. From a systems point of view, though, I know specifically since you've been here, we've talked about changing how we take attendance, right? I mean, that's your job, right? The big system stuff. Explain maybe the attendance changes, and then anything else that you'd like to add to that.
Sure. Yeah, we're just paying more attention to the times that our kids are in school. And we want kids in school when they're healthy enough to be there, right? So we got some feedback from some families when we posted something about attendance, like, hey, just so you know, there's a big virus going around and I want to make sure we're keeping everyone safe. And so do we. We take that part really, really seriously.
Yeah.
But we're just starting to pay more attention to what are the reasons kids aren't coming to school. Because if they're not coming to school, access to the content knowledge that they would need to go on and do a job or go on and be successful in life, one way to measure that is through the ACT, isn't going to be there if they're not regularly in school. So we've been working really closely with our elementary schools. One of our principals at Lakeview, Chris Sapersky, just presented on some of the work that they've been doing around attendance at the AWSA conference, a big statewide conference, and just starting to look at what's the root cause. So does the family have a barrier to getting to school that we need to overcome or we need to work on? Do we have accessibility things? Do we need to move around some of the courses so that the student has a schedule that works a little bit better if they're working 2 jobs outside of school, or if they have other things going on? How do we tailor the school experience to really maximize the student getting what they need out of it?
Sure. And also, too, right, if a student is struggling to get to school on time and they're not there when the bell rings, there's a point at which they can be counted as being in school, right? So if they come
Correct. Yeah.
a little bit late.
Yeah, and in elementary school in particular, we tend to only take attendance 2 periods of the day, right? Morning and afternoon. And then if we've marked the kid absent because they were tardy in the morning, then we've counted them absent for the whole day when it comes to the measures that are used in the state report card system.
Yeah.
So there's just some ways to more accurately reflect attendance. We want to make sure we're getting credit when the kids are in school on this report card system, and that we're honoring the fact that the student isn't in school when they're really not in school. And so by changing a few of the systems ways that we look at the whole picture of how we're recording things to be absolutely in compliance with what's expected by DPI and the law, but yet to make sure that it's really true to form for how they're going to measure it on these report cards. That part has also been really important. And sometimes a new set of eyes can see something that if you've done it for a long time, you just always do it the way you did it.
Yeah.
And so being able to look at some systems and talk to the different people who manage those systems here to say, hey, where are the gaps that are created?
Yeah.
Right? Are we clear with how we're taking attendance, and does it meet what's required by us, through DPI, like I said, in the statutes? But does it also philosophically align to what we're trying to do, where we also want to work closely with families?
Yeah.
Kids need to be on time for things. In life, that's a super important skill. So it's not that we're taking that lightly, but life also happens to people.
Sure.
And people have doctor's appointments, or there's transportation issues or other things. And we want to make sure that we're providing the right amount of grace, but then also not taking a ding in the way that things are measured, when really it wasn't our ding to take, because that student was in school for the majority of the day.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, the idea from knowing how they pull the data and how they look at it matters with how you record it in the first place, right? So I think of it as driving down a mountain. I don't know if people drove stick, but if you didn't downshift and just rode your brakes all the time, they'd overheat. The brakes, there's nothing wrong with the brakes, it's just you were driving incorrectly.
Right.
And it's just you get the wrong warning sign then, I guess. Systematically, what are some other changes that are coming in?
Yeah, I think we're really working on, we do a lot of PLC work in our school district, which is a professional learning community. And that's when a group of teachers get together and they start to talk about what do they need to hold in common across areas so that we ensure that all kids have access to the absolute standards that they need. And then where is there that balance of teacher autonomy to base what's going to happen in the classroom on what the teacher is interested in or what the student is interested in. And we're trying to figure out what that balance is right now. So the PLCs historically were filling out more scope and sequence documents, and some of those were really broad, and they just had some of the state standards identified. But they didn't really talk about what was the experience going to be that, teachers held in common between classes, right? Every social studies student is going to have access to these particular skills. And then within the class, the teacher can personalize it to themselves or to the students. There should be a ton of teacher autonomy in a system. Yeah. But there should also be a basic floor that we all agree to hold in common. All third grade students should have access to these 10 to 15 ELA standards, English Language Arts, so that we can ensure the kids have the equal opportunity to learn the important skills around reading. And then teachers are going to do a million things on top of that. So that's what we do with the teachers when we have those half days, which is we're grateful to this community for supporting that time with our staff. But that's what we do on those days, is we start to figure out what we need to hold in common. And we've had a couple of half days under our belt, and we got some feedback from our staff. It's still not 100% clear what we're doing and why we're doing it. So now we're going to clarify. This week, Wednesday, we're going to get back together as a whole system, all the staff and the PAC, and I'm going to talk about why it's so important that we hold some things in common across every school and every building in our district and every department, so that kids can have a commensurate experience wherever they go. And then the beauty and the autonomy that our incredibly talented staff bring to the table, and then our kids with their passions and what they're interested in bring to the table.
Sure. And I get, like, what I didn't understand about schools before I learned about it was that Dan Bader in third grade struggled with this, but the third grade teacher never actually gets to talk to the fourth grade teacher that has Dan Bader because there's no PLC time. So you don't know that I'm dyslexic and I can't get my numbers backwards. So they start failing the test right away in the beginning because you didn't know, because you didn't get a chance to talk to the third grade teacher.
Right. So how do we build those PLCs then across our district too? Because we want the kids at Luther to be having a similar experience to the kids at Rawson and Blakewood and Lakeview as well. But we also want that autonomy for the experience to be the right one for the kids that are in that classroom and in that school at the same moment. So the systems work is really trying to find the balance between what we need to hold in common. Why are we holding that in common? It meets a state standard. It's something that we know is going to be assessed on these tests. And it's a life skill that we know is important to our kids as they learn how to read or as they learn how to do math. why did I need to know this is a question students have been asking teachers for the length of time. But some of them, we have actual really good answers to where you're going to use all of that information later in life. This is just one measure, these report cards and these tests. That's one measure, but it also kind of tells us, okay, overall, our kids are making gains. Here's how we have to do progress monitoring. So that's when we give like a MAPS test. The high school gives a test called Horizon. The middle school was working on a test called iReady. That gives us more regular progress notes so that we're not just surprised when we take, voila, the big assessment once a year.
Yeah. Both Christy and Carrie mentioned the strategic visioning process. How does that tie? How does developing a mission, a vision, and a purpose tie into report cards?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it has a very distinct tie, right? We want our students to feel successful in school, but the feeling and the doing are two different distinct parts of it, and those both contribute to the student experience. So one of the building blocks of the plan, not only will we have a mission and a vision, the mission's been set for us, that's the moral imperative that our board has already approved. The values need to be held in common by the people who support this organization and lead it. And then the vision, like where do we want to be next, is that aspirational moment to say, what do we want for the students we get the opportunity to serve every day? And that's such an important statement about where we're going next. So on top of that, in the strategic plan, then you make goals in 4 areas. So we're doing the student experience. So what do we really want for our kids, not only with these tests and these report cards, but everything else that goes into it? How do we expand electives? How do we expand opportunities for them to communicate and collaborate and problem solve so that they can go out into the world and do whatever is right for them and their families with the encouragement and the support of their families and their support system outside of school and us? And then one around the employee experience. How do we ensure our teachers know exactly what they should be doing and where they have all the room in the world to be who they are and respect their professionalism in order to be able to determine what's next for the kids that they get to serve with the kids that they get to serve with the students that they work with. And then there's one on community and community relations. How do we make sure our families understand what we're trying to do? How do we create more business partnerships? And then how do we work together so the whole system can move forward? And then the last one is around fiscal stability and facilities. So what do we want in the long-term plan to ensure we can stay fiscally stable and have the facilities that we know we need? This community supported a referendum about 20 years ago that built this beautiful high school, but we need to make sure we have a really solid plan to maintain that and respect the investment the community made, which so far we have been able to. But now to be able to report back to the community some accountability measures and how we're doing on all of those pieces, that's the other exciting part. Once you get the 5-year plan, you make some 1-year markers, and then you have something to go back to the community and say, here's what we worked on and here's how we're doing. And on top of that, then they get the school report card measure as well, so that families start to say, okay, our kids are more than just one test score, 100%. These are the other measures that I understand about the student experience so that I can know that my child is supported and safe and feels like they belong and want to work hard here at school.
And so I guess last question, because I know you got to go. What do you hope, or what do you want a parent to take away when they see the report cards come out?
I want our parents to understand that we're growing, and we're growing in the right direction in many, many, many cases. And we have a plan for the schools where we are not growing at the rate that we wish that we were, right? So a lot of our school report card, a good chunk of it gets based on growth, how students do from one year to the next. And that's something we pay really close attention to. We're working to close gaps for all students all the time, but we want to know that every single student is growing at a really nice pace along the way. And that's the thing that, as you get your child's school report card score, as you see what's out there, pay attention to that growth score. Is that higher than the state average? Are we moving in the right direction to close some gaps on behalf of the kids we get to serve every day?
Sure. Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Okay.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the SMI podcast. A couple of reminders. That strategic planning process is open to anyone in the community to attend. A lot of thoughtful people are giving a lot of their time and energy to the process, and if you want to be a part of it or observe, you're more than welcome. Second, Please pay attention to another deliberative process going on right now. The South Milwaukee School Board is considering a potential referendum. It's important to follow along as board members debate and discuss the needs of the district and how to meet them. You can learn more on our website, www.sdsm.k12.wi.us. My name is Daniel Bader. Thanks for listening.